Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. To a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. It is the 3rd hour after sunrise in the city of Ravenna, one of the quiet administrative hearts of the Roman Empire. Not the part with rampaging legions and fiery Caesar speeches. No, we've filed that under too energetic. This is the Roman Empire of ink pots and scrolls, of census ledgers, and very serious men scratching wax tablets with incredibly unimpressed expressions. Yes, here where our story begins, the drama is bureaucratic, and the excitement comes in papyrus form. Today, a junior clerk named Gaius Tertinius has awoken with one singular thought. He must make absolutely sure he remembered to bring his provincial import stamp form, Dictation. B. He did not. Outside his modest shared quarters, the sunlight yawns down upon cobbled streets and sleepy limestone walls. A baker sets out his 3rd batch of spelt biscuits, more suitable for shingles than dessert, and a laundry boy hums a dithering hymn while detangling a toga from a laurel bush. Meanwhile, inside the Praetorian Records Office, mourning is underway at an excruciatingly responsible pace. At a heavy wooden desk, one Lucilla, scribe extraordinaire, is squinting at a list of tax exemptions so long, it may, in fact, be a spiral. Her quill twitches at the corner with the silent fury of a woman forced to determine why a goat fleece merchant from Numidia hasn't paid his late papyrus surrender fee. Across the room, Marcus Flavinius the Elder, who is to no one's surprise also not much younger, sharpens his stylus with monastic focus. He is on his 42nd year of transcribing trade data from the olive oil districts of Hispania. He has not blinked since Saturnalia, and let us not forget Antoninus, supervisor of grain requisitions, whose face bears the permanent expression of a man who dreams only of spreadsheets. Except paper hasn't been invented yet, and so he must live his passion through scroll columns and numerals etched in soul-sapping silence. He is currently engaged in an enthralling dispute with the Culinary Logistics Committee over whether stale barley loaves count toward meeting imperial caloric rations. But despite the solemnity, life here has its moments. Shortly after the midday water-wine break, always 2 parts water for safety, a courier named Crispus arrives with a truly riveting announcement. A shipment of wax tablets has been misrouted. They've gone north to Mediolanum instead of east to Byzantium. Eyebrows raise perceptibly. Marcus Flavinius nearly gasps. Lucilla slowly closes her ledger, not to rest, but a rare thrill, to investigate. Misrouted office supplies are as close to treason as one can get, without absolutely meaning it. And together, they rally the local dispatch clarification team. This consists of 2 junior clerks and a retired centurion named Rutilius, who once led a battalion, but now coordinates mail on Tuesdays. Rutilius takes out his optimum quill, a birthday gift from Emperor Theodosius II, or so he claims, and begins an incident report so methodical that the ink dries of its own boredom. In the midst of all this, a single poetic note hums through the halls. It's Brother Oswin's cat, Minimus, purring insistently against the warm stone edge of a scroll cupboard. Someone has indeed remembered his lunch. As the sun sinks toward its golden siesta, the air fills with the soft rhythm of wooden sandals, distant lute practice, and the comforting murmurs of scribes discussing whether ink made with raven bone ages better than ink made with ordinary soot. A debate which, for the record, will never be settled, nor pursued with any real urgency. And so, The day closes not with a clash of swords, but with the shuffling of paperwork into organized chaos and the hiss of long, scroll-laden drawers being tucked very carefully into place. Lamps are lit, porridge is reheated, and the mysteries of the census, who really owns the 3 goats listed as communal assets in Subdistrict 14, remain deliciously unresolved. So drift gently now. Let wax tablets and olive branches meander through your dreams. Tomorrow, there will be another thrilling form to copy out in triplicate. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. Imagine, if you will, the city of Rome just as the sunlight spills lazily over its 100 hills. A city not ablaze with drama or conquest today, but positively brimming with quiet paperwork. Yes, on this particular morning in the imperial heart of the world, nobody is getting stabbed in the forum or voicing lofty ideals. Instead, Public Secretary Alias is fussing over the exact volume of grain arriving from Egypt, which has, once again, been inaccurately tallied by the dock officials at Ostia. If you think the Roman Empire was nothing but gladiators and gossip, allow this sleepy corner of history to gently correct you. Our friend Alias, balding, bespectacled, and deeply in love with his inkwell, is nestled behind a desk made of olive wood, surrounded by scrolls so numerous they appear to have taken root and begun their own bureaucratic ecosystem. He deals not in blood or conquest, but in ratios, shipments, and the subtle sport of interpretive imperial accounting. The imperial calendar has assigned this day as one of solemn inspection, which means that various scroll bearers, tallymen, and junior scribes are drifting in and out of Alias's office like toga-clad clouds, each whispering news of barley shipments and garum inventory levels. Garum, for the record, is a fermented fish sauce so potent it has been described as smelling like Neptune's armpit. But it was a delicacy prized across the empire. Few things in Rome flowed more reliably than gossip and garum, and there's an entire department in the administrative quarter dedicated to tracking its taxation, transport, and, one assumes, eventual leakage. Outside the office, a bored legionary named Marcus Publius Drusus stands guard. Marcus joined the army expecting glory, maybe a little panache, and perhaps a chance to be sculpted into mythic reliefs. Instead, he's guarding the hallway where the Empire's spreadsheet equivalent lives and breathes. He's currently counting cobblestones and wondering if his spear needs dusting. Meanwhile, across the city at the Tabularium, the Grand Archive of Rome, an old archivist named Flavia is hunting down a single missing census scroll from a shelf so high and so dusty that even spiders have unionized. She mutters to herself in soft Latin curses as she climbs. Known to her colleagues as Flavia the Precise, she once spotted a decimal point out of place during an audit of temple donations and nearly caused a minor religious reform. These are the individuals who made the empire function not with thunderous battle cries, but with memorandums and mid-afternoon figs. Today's particular excitement, which is to say, the administrative equivalent of a chariot crash, is the suspected embezzlement of 3 sacks of state-issued wool. These were last seen leaving the central textile repository, but never made it to the barracks where tunics are sewn for the legions. Alias drafts an internal memorandum, which is frankly a thrilling word in this context, diplomatically suggesting that someone along the delivery chain has either misplaced or repurposed the wool, possibly into a really lovely throw blanket. A routine inquiry begins, forms are filled, clarifications are requested, a travelling notary is summoned, the kind who travels with his own seal, wax and furrowed brow. No culprits are named, of course, not yet, This is Rome. Even suspicion has a process, and that process involves stampings, duplicate copies, and at least one meeting with a man named Gaius, who speaks only in formal salutations. A short walk away, an accountant named Severinus is reviewing marble procurement requests, making sure that the new public lavatory won't be coated in Cleopatra-level luxury. He's denied 2 senators' requests for imported pink veined slabs, with the simple yet powerful pencil scrawl, "No." As the sun shifts and climbs, the corridors of imperial function hum softly with sandals on stone, quills scratching parchment, and the muted knocks of couriers delivering yet more scrolls to yet more desks. Nothing explodes. No one is assassinated. But somewhere, in Rome's quiet labyrinth of bureaucracy, a clearer picture is formed of a civilization knit together not just by legions and laurels, but by ledger entries and consistent grain supply. And just beyond Aelius's window, a pigeon perches on a statue of Minerva and relieves itself with admirable bureaucratic punctuality. Same time every day. Outside, the bells marking the second hour of the Roman workday chime gently, reminding everyone that lunch is still a hopeful dream. The day continues, filed neatly under usual. Now, as the shadow of the Senate's column graces the archive's sunlit courtyard, we shall slip quietly into the next corner of this dutiful empire, where scrolls are sacred, and no spoonful of fish sauce escapes taxation. Somewhere between the crackling of the oil lamps and the shuffling of sandals upon marble, we find ourselves in the heart of Rome's great machinery, not in the Colosseums, nor in the Senate where togas rustled in petty outrage, but in a quieter, humbler chamber. The tabularium. You might imagine Roman government being all sword-point politics and dramatic oration, but the reality, the truly boring and sumptuous reality, lived in parchment and clerks and an unending sea of wax tablets. The tabularium, nestled snugly beside the forum like a bureaucratic barnacle, was the grand archive of Roman records. And oh, what a thrill that was. Imagine halls lined with shelves stacked not with exciting scrolls of political intrigue, but with extensive inventories, grain allotments, tax receipts, marriage registries, and, on special occasions, the census returns of goats. At the very center of this parchment palace, a scribe named Lucius Quintilius sat hunched at a desk, worn smooth by repetition, diligently copying lists of provincial expenditures with a goose-feather quill, the ink slowly fading into an erasable eternity. His job, dear dreamer, was not to shape imperial destiny or sway great minds, but to ensure that Rome's annual wheat imports into Ostia were accurately recorded, in triplicate. Lucius was a quiet man, known among his fellow scribes for 2 things: his exceptionally neat handwriting and his uncanny ability to nap with his eyes open. Indeed, no one was really sure whether Lucius was a master of still concentration or merely snoozing through the empire's economic balance sheets, which, to be fair, looked suspiciously like horizontal lullabies. Now, lest you think the mighty Roman Empire was an unthinking juggernaut of marble and muscle, know this: it survived for so long not because of wars won or emperors crowned, but because of forms filled out properly and filed in the correct cubiculum. The daily grind began with the opening of shutters to let in the sunlight, because lighting torches during the day was considered wasteful, and Rome, for all her grandeur, despised needless extravagance when it came to paperwork. A clerk named Aelia, whose sandal straps squeaked with each step, meticulously dusted the tablets before logging the aqueduct maintenance for the week. For 8 solid hours, The tabularium hummed with the sound of scratches, sighs, and the occasional dropped stylus, followed by intimate discussions about whether wax was too hot or too firm to write on. People do not often think of Rome as a kingdom of schedules, but it was. Every scroll stored in these shelves had been the result of a process, often supervised by a weary official with a name like Gaius or Flavius, always squinting too much and drinking too little water. Each edict, from grain prices in Hispania to sanitation rules in Antioch, was documented, redocumented, archived, then locked away in a cabinet that someone would forget the key to for 300 years. Of course, errors did happen. The empire was vast, and quills were fragile. Once, there was an uproar when a clerk accidentally recorded 500 chariots instead of 5, leading the Strategos of Cappadocia to prepare for an imaginary war. The clerical mistake was eventually discovered, but not before an impressive parade drill was executed entirely for nothing, which most soldiers described as both confusing and oddly enjoyable. The tabularium was not a place of action, but reflection. Every measurement of grain was a whisper of survival. Every note about boundary stones was a promise of order. It may not have been thrilling, but Rome's heartbeat was etched into these carefully curated lines. A civilization not carried by chaos, but cradled by the comforting rhythm of routine. Behind the brass-handled doors, in the cozy dullness of ink-scented silence, the empire held its breath, not during battles or festivals, but during audits, and in the hands of clerks and scribes, Rome's greatest power was not the sword, it was the ledger. And as dusk filtered softly through the latticed windows, and Lucius rested his forehead gently against a column, either deep in thought or halfway to dreams, the daily scroll was closed, labelled, and placed with gentle care upon its stack. Another day filed into history. In the distance, a bell chimed, not for war, not for coronation, but for the cleaning shift of the fountain maintenance team, a profoundly uneventful yet crucial ritual in the bureaucracy that kept the city fragrant and relatively slime-free. And so, as the great city exhaled its midday sigh and rolled gently into the evening, we drift onward, where other corners of calm governance await, in places where even the most thrilling scandal involves a missing shipment of bricks. Somewhere between the marble columns and the mildly confused scribes, in the heart of the Roman Empire, paperwork was having what could be described as a spectacularly average moment. This was not the arena of gladiators or the Senate ablaze with Cicero's rhetorical thunder. No, the real symphony of empire unfolded in the offices of the cursus publicus, Rome's state-run postal and courier system, a glittering web of admin that stretched from Britannia's windswept outposts to the sun-drenched sands of Egypt. At dawn, a weary clerk named Quintus Flavius Minor to distinguish him from the other 3 Quintus Flavi in the department, pried open his bleary eyes, dutifully wrapped his toga with all the swagger of a man who had to be at his desk by the second crow of the rooster, and trudged across the forum like a philosopher who had misplaced his will to debate. His destination, the records annex, subsection B, scroll storage. An office so notoriously uneventful, it was once mistaken for a basilica and nearly got its own saint. Minor's task for the day? Verifying travel permits for mule-drawn wagons attempting to cross the Apennines with loads of olive oil thicker than a senator's ego. This would involve examining wax tablets, cross-referencing route codes, and, should the mood truly strike, affixing the official seal, a ring engraved with a very bored-looking eagle. As he sat down under the faint flicker of an oil lamp, early Roman bureaucratic lighting was not known for its ambience. Miner sighed softly. Before him lay a stack of travel permits so tall, it would have qualified as architecture. Each defined route, starting point, end point, cargo contents, estimated mule muscle per amphora, and the clearest instruction of all: approved routes only. No shortcuts through barbarian territory. Do not attempt to bribe the centurions. To warm up his wrists for the endless wax scratching ahead, Miner reached for his favorite stylus, the one with the ivory end, a gift from his grandmother, who had once kissed the toes of Emperor Hadrian's statue and proclaimed it adequate. With stylus poised over tablet, he began transcribing a travel request submitted 3 weeks prior by a certain Lucius Cestius Gracchus, a merchant who had managed the rare feat of confusing Hispania with Gallia. Miner let out a noise somewhere between a chuckle and a yawn. "You cannot send figs through the Pyrenees in March, Lucius," he muttered, "unless your donkeys are equipped with snowshoes and a fondness for frostbite." Once, years ago, Miner had harbored dreams of debating in the Forum, dazzling audiences with carefully crafted oratory on the nature of justice, republics, and why toga stains should be considered a civic matter. But fate, and a slightly dishonest aptitude test, had placed him here, amidst ledgers, wax, and the thrilling ambiguity of provincial taxation codes. Outside the record's annex, booted steps echoed faintly as a messenger from Gaul entered with a pouch full of updates, sandwiched between confidential military dispatches and a receipt for too many jars of fermented fish sauce. The courier, his sandals more patches than leather, saluted half-heartedly and tossed the pouch into the nearest receptacle, also known as a table with a discouraged corner. Miner peeked at the new arrivals. Among them, a form marked urgent in subtly aggressive Latin caught his eye. It concerned a provincial governor in Dalmatia requesting additional census enumerators due to rising complaints that the population was being counted twice, once sober and once after the midday wine. After a few seconds of pondering, Miner jotted, "Possible solution, count only before breakfast," and filed it meticulously under ideas that may require divine intervention. The hours passed with all the sprightly speed of a sundial in winter. By mid-afternoon, the hall had grown warm with the aroma of old parchment, slow-burning oil, and the faint but ever-persistent hint of someone's forgotten lunch. A junior clerk drifted by with a tray of watered wine, which according to imperial guidelines was allowed once per diem unless morale had dipped into dangerous poetry-writing territory. Rome may have conquered the known world, but here in the empire's administrative spleen, conquest came in the form of updated livestock counts and complaints about inconsistent amphora sizes. Outside, the sun sank gently behind the rooftops of the Aventine Hill, slathering the tiles in gold. Miner, his eyes now sliding close between blinks, signed the final travel permit of the stack and slid it into its scroll tube with the careful satisfaction of a man who had done his bit for imperial transport. And as the oil lamp flickered its last warm sigh and the rustle of parchment quieted into the hush of twilight, the empire sailed sleepily onward. Somewhere on the horizon, new shipments of census ink arrived, and new roads begged for the dignity of regulation. By the year 117 AD, the Roman Empire had reached its greatest territorial extent under Emperor Trajan. From the windswept moors of Britannia to the heat-drunken sands of Mesopotamia, the eagle had flown far. But tonight, we will not charge into battle or map the boundaries of empire. No, we will languidly recline in the bureaucracy of a provincial Roman tax office, where the truly thrilling sound is not swords clashing, but styluses scratching. In the city of Antioch, a jewel of the eastern provinces and a favourite winter retreat for emperors and those paying taxes under mild protest, the day began, as it always did, with the rattling wheeze of the abacus being cleared. The provincial procurator, Publius Septimius Rutilius, an unremarkable man whose greatest ambition was to own a larger inkwell, rose slightly late that morning. He lay in his triclinium, staring at the ceiling fresco. It was supposed to be Diana hunting, but due to a mix-up in the paint shop, she looked somewhat like a startled merchant waving breadsticks. With the smooth discipline of a man well practiced in the ancient art of doing just enough to remain employed, Publius eased on his senatorial toga, a garment that managed to be both stately and the worst invention in the history of seated comfort. It was said that no one wore the toga well. One endured it. Outside his domus, the streets buzzed gently with the foot traffic of vendors, soldiers, and those attempting to pay their tribute without actually bringing currency. Livestocks were technically taxable, but difficult to fit in the accounting scrolls. Publius's office was located in the civil basilica, a three-naved hall of stern marble and echoes. His desk, sadly, was made of wood. Behind it sat Cicero Minor, not related to the orator, but fond of pretending he was, and who had once given a passionate speech about grain shortages that accidentally caused a riot in a bakery. Today's primary business involved the grain requisition forms from the Syrian hinterlands. These arrived as they always did, tied with twine, splattered with wax, and suspiciously coffee-stained centuries before coffee reached the empire. Publius flipped through the scroll. 50 modii from Tyros, 73 from Emesa, and, he squinted, 684 from a village noted only as the place where the goat sings. Cicero Minor nodded gravely. I've sent a courier to verify the singing goat. If it's a metaphor, we may need to find them for misleading poetry. A soft tap at the door signaled the arrival of a municipal clerk bearing a new set of parchment complaints. Our fountain is clogged again, the clerk announced, dropping a scroll with a wince, as though he himself had been splashed by the disgruntled nymph it depicted. Not our jurisdiction, Publius murmured, adding the scroll to a growing pile labelled in almost loving cursive, to be ignored until they forget. By midday, the office reached its peak buzzing potential, with tax disputes, property registrations, and one elderly man convinced his toga should legally constitute a tent, demanding tax exemption. To break the monotony, Publius occasionally wandered over to the courtyard, where the provincial census chart was etched into a grandstanding tablet open to public view, and to public scorn. Yes, he remarked, pointing solemnly. That's where we accidentally listed a goat as both a property and a dependent. You can't claim it twice, Cicero Minor whispered with scandalized pride. But it was noble of you to try. Among their greatest daily tasks was updating the imperial census list. This was no simple affair, as people in Roman provinces had an unhelpful tendency to age, marry, die, or change their names to escape minor debts. Sometimes, entire households would mysteriously vanish between columns, only to reappear one county over under the new and suspiciously identical name of Household Urs Anonymous. But the peace of Rome depended on these quiet numbers. How many mouths to feed, how many feet to conscript into sandals and legions, and how many taxes could be politely asked for and firmly demanded if politely refused. As the sun sloped lazily toward the horizon, gilding even the most humorless scrolls with a golden glow, the office began its sacred final act, the ritualistic sigh of dismissal. Cicero Minor extinguished the oil lamp. Publius sealed the last parchment with a wax blob that resembled, if one squinted, the emperor's profile after a long night. Outside, the sounds of Antioch shifted. The clink of amphorae returned to shelves, the gentle arguments of card game losers, the murmur of the Tiber's distant cousin, the Orontes, and within the heart of the empire's filing cabinet, all was sufficiently handled. Tomorrow, of course, the goats would try again. But for now, somewhere beyond the paperwork, a nighttime breeze rustled the pages of a census awaiting review and beckoned us onward toward even quieter affairs in the stillness of a Roman morning, long before the sun remembered to peek over the red-tiled roofs of Aquileia or Antioch. The wheels of empire were already quietly squeaking into motion, not with the clash of swords or the kind of imperial declarations that poets over-dramatize, but with a nuanced, sleepy sort of bureaucracy that, if dramatized too closely, might cause an insomniac to finally nod off. It is somewhere between the 6th and 7th hour, which our modern minds would recognize as about, oh, brunch o'clock, and in the tabularium, a sort of Roman archive and records office, scrolls rustle faintly like the soft wind brushing over olive groves. The scribes, or clerks, are already hunched over parchment, their styluses poised in a kind of balletic lethargy, copying tax receipts, court summaries, and whatever thrilling proceedings came out of yesterday's sewage maintenance hearing. Yes, to the ancient Roman administrator, morning glory came not from conquest or forum debate, but from figuring out who still owed taxes on their third vineyard. Let us now drift into the woolen toga of one such man. Enter Lucius Flavius Salutaris, junior assistant to the deputy of routine census maintenance, a title that barely fits on a wax tablet, but comes with precisely 0 denarii of hazard pay. Lucius's duties are many, if many can be stretched to include things like verifying the number of goats in District 14, or determining whether Marcus Pompilius's bathhouse counts as a public good, or a moist luxury asset. Lucius, like many in Roman civil service, works by the principle of paulum facere, or doing just enough to avoid notice. His main ally in this quest is the marvel of Roman administrative tools, the abacus, a calculating device that, if spun just right, can simulate intense labor while leaving ample mental space for daydreaming about lunch. But lunch is hours away, and there's a thrilling conundrum on the docket today. A property boundary dispute between the widows of 2 rival senators over a disputed fig tree. Both claim the tree's fruit, which ripens tastelessly each September, and both have produced contradictory deeds, one dating to the consulship of a man famously ejected for excessive hiccuping during civic prayers. To untangle such a dispute, Lucius must consult the magistrate's duplicate copy stored in the city archives, located inconveniently in a building shared with a musical troupe that rehearses the hydraulis, a type of water organ that sounds like a startled goose echoing through the baths of Caracalla. As Lucius listens to the distant honking of hydraulic harmonies, he evaluates the real tragedy of this case: the fig tree's unfortunate proximity to the border of 2 households equally fond of fruit-based legal claims. He carefully pencils in a suggestion: trees shall be property of neither and shared under seasonal rotation, with disputes henceforth solved by coin toss or seniority of wrinkles. This kind of arbitrary, slightly poetic ruling is not uncommon in Roman bureaucracy, where officials were, above all, artists in the medium of compromise. Beyond Lucius's sun-dappled window, Rome simmers with the quiet machinery of maintenance. A municipal slave adjusts statuary pigeons atop a fountain. A street sweeper gathers errant laurel leaves dislodged during last night's enthusiastic oratory practice. Somewhere, a city augur reads the flights of birds for signs of divine approval regarding new grain tariffs. And all the while, reports arrive and are copied in triplicate. The Roman postal system, the cursus publicus, ensures that memos, census rolls, and urgent requests to fix aqueduct leaks reach city offices in remarkable time, only 3 to 6 weeks, assuming fair weather and bribe-happy mules. These messages arrive in oil-sealed satchels bearing such important news as the bridge in Segovia has been repaired with suboptimal stones. Citizens concerned seek inspection. Lucius, upon reading this, nods solemnly before placing the scroll under the ledger marked moderately urgent, not today. In truth, Roman administrators had mastered the fine art of triage long before your inbox did. Matters were divided into categories such as urgentum pro forma, urgent on paper, important sed ignobil, important but dull, and res que irritant, things that irritate but cannot be avoided. As Lucius completes his morning's ledger entries and begins to fold up his chair, a rickety thing he inherited from a predecessor who reportedly died of calendar exhaustion, he glances at the sundial. Still hours before the official midday meal, but the sky shines with the warm indifference of imperial time. The empire spins, taxes are tallied, disputes are categorized, and the fig tree, well, the fig tree will warrant at least another hearing before olives are in season. And as Lucius moves to approve a request to build a minor road that leads somewhere unutterably forgettable, the clouds gather faintly overhead, promising perhaps a drizzle, just enough to affect paperwork, but not dramatically. A perfect time to slide gently into the next layer of Roman calm. As we drift further into the empire's daily rhythms, the roads ahead wind toward a new kind of monotony, scheduling festivals, and the subtle stresses of amphora shortages. It is a little-known reality, and frankly, a rather disappointing one, that much of the governing brilliance of the Roman Empire came down to an astonishing quantity of wax tablets, repetitive lists, and people walking briskly down corridors in sandals, trying to act more important than they were. Let us now drift into the polite clatter of quills and the gentle rustling of scrolls inside one of the most influential institutions of imperial Rome, the tabularium, the central repository of Roman records. Think of it as the closest thing the ancient world had to a government filing cabinet, but made of marble and echoing with the quiet tedium of bureaucratic purpose. Perched on the slopes of the Capitoline Hill, the grand stone-faced building watched over the forum like a stern librarian who'd seen it all and very much preferred it alphabetized. Inside one would find scribes painstakingly inscribing tax records, property deeds, senatorial decrees, all onto strips of parchment and wax tablets that were stacked, tucked, or occasionally lost beneath a pile of papyrus, whose original purpose had long since been forgotten. Now, not everyone who worked here was a scribe, of course. Some were scroll runners, young lads and lassies tasked with sprinting from office to office, delivering documents with the urgency of someone trying to look busy until lunch. Their sandals slapped the limestone with a sound that could only be described as a wet hiccup wearing flip-flops. Among these noble bearers of bureaucracy, there was Marcus Plautlicus, whose lifelong ambition was to retire early and raise chickens somewhere quiet. preferably Gaul. Until that day, he contented himself racing errant census updates between rooms barely 30 paces apart. His beard was modest, his tunic perpetually ink-stained, and his signature move was mumbling, sorry, wrong office," as he wandered circles in hallways that had no right being as confusing as they were. The Roman Empire wasn't merely successful because of its legions or its aqueducts. No, much of its glory came down to its unshakable belief in administrative paperwork. And much of that paperwork was the handiwork of individuals like Scribe Tertius, an officious gentleman whose spiritual alignment was neutral paperwork. Tertius was the sort of man who lived for orderly columns, both of numbers and of people. His dream journal, historians suspect, may well have consisted of inventory forms narrated aloud by Cicero. He spent his days supervising tax assessments for distant provinces with a passion that bordered on poetic. "Ah, Lusitania," he would murmur wistfully, checking column totals. "Your olive yield is up 6%, you spicy fiscal temptress." The empire was thick with taxes, port duties, trade levies, inheritance taxes, even a tax on unmarried men, as if the gods themselves disapproved of bachelorhood. All of this naturally required documentation, stamping, and the occasional scolding letter from a regional proconsul complaining that someone incorrectly recorded 30 amphorae of wine as 300. To avoid total chaos, the Romans employed a class of officials called censitores, freelance tax agents whose job was essentially to visit towns, count things, and then make everyone very nervous. They often arrived in pairs, like morally disappointed owls, bearing scrolls and sighs. The townsfolk, well versed in their methods, would pretend not to know how many goats they had, until bribed with dates. Meanwhile, back in the tabularium, Tertius was composing a stern memorandum to the governor of Britannia, whose recent reports had been sealed with what could only be described as an aggressive amount of wax and chicken feathers. "Is this a signature?" he muttered, tilting the parchment. "Or did someone spill soup and call it a legal affirmation?" The day marched on, time measured not in sand, but in scrolls read, inkpots depleted, and whispers of impending revisions. Occasionally, a senatorial clerk would enter and recount a grand decree from Rome that affected absolutely nothing, apart from the way tax forms should be folded. The scribes would nod solemnly, bury the change beneath a pile of other unread updates, and carry on without blinking. The only real excitement was when someone brought in honey cakes from a nearby stall. Then conversations erupted like mild sunsets, and everyone promptly forgot whether Cappadocia owed 3 shipments of marble or 4. And so, behind the imperial facades and glories carved in stone, the Roman Empire was safeguarded not by swords, but by scrolls, signatures, and the stubborn persistence of civil servants who believed, deeply, devoutly, that nothing said justice like a properly bound tax ledger. Somewhere, the sun dipped low over the Tiber, casting golden light along endless shelves of records no one had read in years. But they were there, sleeping quietly under the dust of diligence. And just beyond those marble walls, something altogether different and slightly smellier had begun stirring in the Roman marketplaces. While legions marched and emperors plotted, there was one quietly dignified figure in every Roman province who held more sway over laundry schedules and provincial horse feed than over destiny itself: the Roman provincial governor. Not the brooding type you'd see on a marble pedestal, no. This was a man, almost always a man, who woke up to scrolls, not swords. His morning routine rarely involved battle cries, but often featured crusty bread and meticulous parchment reviews in his bathrobe, or the Roman equivalent thereof. Life as a Roman governor was astonishingly administrative, appointed by the emperor or the Senate, depending on the province and on Rome's current political mood, which admittedly fluctuated like a toga in the wind. The governor's job was to keep the provincial gears turning. Not dramatically, mind you, just smoothly. Taxes should appear on time. Roads should not collapse. Locals, ideally, should remain only mildly resentful. Their main weapon, the stylus, held delicately between two fingers as they reviewed fiscal reports, sheep censuses, and complaints from elderly farmers about legionaries spooking their goats. It was penmanship, not swordsmanship, that sustained the empire. In fact, one of the most important daily tasks was deliberating local disputes. A governor might spend an entire afternoon listening to two rival olive oil merchants argue whether one had been secretly watering down his amphorae. After carefully weighing the testimony, inspecting a sample, and suppressing a yawn, the governor could proclaim judgment with all the solemn dignity of Jupiter himself, declaring, say, that from thenceforth all oil must be tasted by a neutral goat. Oh yes, Roman goats were occasionally employed in various forms of rustic quality control, though their expertise remained unaccredited. Governors were often accompanied by a staff of scribes, interpreters, and minor officials known as apparitores, who carried scrolls, took notes, and occasionally made eye contact with petitioners when the governor was on break. Some governors fancied themselves amateur philosophers or poets, and might spend late evenings composing stern odes to the concept of bureaucratic efficiency. These were never published, and mercifully so. Their homes, more properly termed praetoria, often looked out over scenic forums where civic banquets, philosophical debates, and the occasional tax protest unfolded under the benevolent gaze of garden statuary. The governor, elbow deep in scrolls, would sometimes pause to sip watered wine and contemplate the thrilling glide of a bureaucratic system functioning just well enough not to collapse. From Britannia's damp outposts to the sunbeam-drenched villas of Hispania, the ideal governor was expected to be incorruptible, which naturally meant that many weren't. To be fair, an unbribed official in Roman times was about as rare as a toga that fit properly after Saturnalia feasting. Still, some tried. There were noble ones, practical, fair-minded administrators who genuinely wanted their provincial peasants to sleep soundly, unbothered by roving tax collectors or improperly filed tithing forms. One such man, Lucius Calpurnius Flavus, governor of a mid-sized Gallic province, was so dedicated to administrative order that he personally inspected every bridge, well, and cobblestone his engineers maintained. While no one invited him to dinner willingly, his ledgers were as accurate as a sundial in the forum, and locals eventually began referring to him as Lucius the listmaker. Even his enemies grudgingly admired his record-keeping. When pirates briefly raided the coastline, Lucius's retaliation campaign began not with swords, but with a detailed inventory of confiscated fish. He believed in fighting chaos with calmness and salmon statistics. Despite the slow nature of governance, the job wasn't without risk. If suspiciously large sums disappeared, or rebellions sprang up due to poor judgment, these could trigger unpleasant letters from Rome, or worse, senatorial inquiries. Some governors found themselves suddenly transferred to much smaller provinces, or, in one case, reassigned to the thrilling post of Imperial Inspector of Warehouse Locks. This was as exciting as it sounds, but most governors with their daily wax tablet reviews and slow afternoon walks through the census archives, preferred monotony. In a world where emperors rose and fell with dramatic flair, they found comfort in the consistent drone of paperwork. The empire, after all, needed more ledgers than legends to last. And as another provincial sun set over ledgers and livestock quotas, our dear scribes laid down their quills and whispered of tomorrow's complicated grain tariffs, soon to be examined with the tender care of a baker examining slightly over-baked focaccia. Now, let us quietly follow the paperwork trail, leaving governors to their olives, goats, and carefully flickering oil lamps, as we drift gently onward to another corner of this methodically maintained empire. As the Mediterranean sun draped its golden cloak across the tiled roofs of the city, many Romans began turning their attention to something truly thrilling: filing paperwork. Yes, Rome had conquered much of the known world, built aqueducts that could make your average plumber weep with admiration, and maintained roads in better condition than some 21st century highways. But behind every triumphal arch and beneath every senator's toga was an empire utterly obsessed with the subtle ecstasy of administrative delegation. Enter the cursus publicus, the imperial courier service, basically the Roman version of express mail, though slightly slower, moderately dustier, and occasionally interrupted by barbarians. This government-run logistical marvel was the bloodstream of bureaucratic Rome. Messages from governors, census results, or fan letters from Gaul all passed through this network of stables, inns, and professional letter runners who had the stamina of Olympic athletes and the handwriting of exhausted scribes. At the core of this system was the tabularius, Rome's answer to the humble mailman. Picture a man in a tunic, sandals rubbed nearly into oblivion, clutching a leather satchel full of imperial memos and a wax tablet that might reveal a shipment of garum was delayed in Ostia. A true tragedy, as fermented fish sauce waits for no one. Of course, the tabularius was only as good as the bureaucracy that stood above him, which is to say, very, very layered. An official known as the Magister Officiorum oversaw the imperial correspondence, a man whose entire career could pivot on how smoothly epistles moved across provinces. Rome didn't care if you were fighting rebels in Britannia, if you hadn't filled out Form L2SV-B before engaging in hostilities. Well, that was going in your personnel file. Much of the paperwork revolved around keeping tabs on a population known for moving inconveniently often and occasionally revolting. Hence, the census. Taken every 5 years in the Republic and later adapted in various forms by the Empire, the census was not just a head count. It was a deep dive into your property, family, slaves, and other personal trivia that today might be found in a mildly invasive customer survey. But while the census was an impressive feat of organization and civil management, it also had the cozy drama of a soap opera. Citizens might underreport property to avoid taxes, overreport children to gain favor, or conveniently forget to mention their third cousin living in the grain storage room. The censors, officials responsible for conducting the census and maintaining public morality, were a mixture of data analysts and moral busybodies. A censor might note not only how many goats you owned, but also if you had been seen loitering near disreputable taverns or, horror of horrors, skipping public baths. Speaking of data management, let us drift our focus to an unsung layer of Roman record keeping: wax tablets and styluses. While today, we might bemoan forgetting a password to our cloud storage, back then, a Roman administrator's worst nightmare was smudging an imperial rescript because of a particularly warm day. Wax tablets were reusable, but not entirely stable, with a single clumsy elbow potentially erasing the tax records of an entire town. Many a sleepless night was spent muttering phrases like, "Did I record that Leggett's corn shipment? Or did I dream it again?" But not all bureaucrats had bad posture and ink-stained fingers. Some had very good sandals. In particular, the rationales, financial officers posted across the empire, managed imperial revenues and were often gifted with an uncanny ability to stretch a denarius. These men operated far from Rome but answered directly to the emperor, which could either mean swift promotion or exile depending on whether the silver mines in Hispania yielded enough to cover the army's new winter cloaks. Still, for all its layers, ledgers, and letters, Rome's bureaucracy functioned with a certain sleepy elegance, like the gentle lap of waves against Ostia's port, or the rustling of papyrus scrolls on a marble desk during a lazy third hour of the Roman workday. Perhaps Rome's true strength wasn't merely in its legions, but in its ability to schedule, sort, and summarize with sublime precision. And so, as one more mule trotted along the Appian Way, bearing dispatches across sunlit hills, the empire continued not with trumpet blasts or epic battles, but with one memorandum at a time. Somewhere, a governor was now updating his grain inventories, and somewhere else, a tired scribe was reaching for his stylus again, as we begin to turn the page toward what comes next in this grand and restful empire. Somewhere in the heart of a dusty Roman province, where fig trees drooped from boredom and even the lizards took afternoon naps, we find yet another cornerstone of imperial Roman life that vibrated with thrilling monotony: the census. Yes, that most pulse-quickening of paper-shuffling enterprises, conducted every 5 years, unless it rained or the previous census scrolls got eaten by goats. It was the kind of event that made tax collectors weep with joy and the citizenry. Just weep. Now, don't imagine the census as a brisk little checkmark session. Oh no. This was a grand bureaucratic ballet, with scribes, tablets, wax pens, and men with extremely serious facial hair moving in precise, almost cat-like coordination. Citizens queued in neat rows, hands wrinkled with papyrus anxiety, waiting their turn to declare exactly how many goats, fields, enslaved persons, and sullen teenage sons they were responsible for. The Roman censor was the maestro of this dull symphony, not to be confused with someone who deletes all the spicy bits from scrolls. No, censor. In this case, referred to a powerful magistrate whose job was less about scandal management and more about population bookkeeping. There were usually two of them, because even in ancient Rome, misery loved company. Censors wielded impressive authority. Not only did they count things, and people, reluctantly, they also evaluated morals. That's right. The same person checking how many olive trees you owned might also wag a finger at you for public drunkenness or calling your neighbor's toga a bit too breezy. Let's picture a sleepy Roman town, say Mediolanum, modern-day Milan before the fashion took over. Grizzled citizens draped in their most census-appropriate tunics filed into the forum, gripping little slivers of bark with their property notes scribbled in hopeful wax. Lucius, the local goat enthusiast, stood in line grumbling to himself. "When I said I wanted my affairs in order, I didn't mean this order," he muttered, clutching a list with 23 goats, 2 slightly delinquent sons, and 1 wife who did not appreciate being enumerated before the goats. Behind a collapsible desk, a marvel of regulation-sized planks and speculative sturdiness, sat Gaius Tertinius, junior scribe and part-time dreamer of early retirement. He listened patiently to Lucius's goat-heavy declaration, scratched a few notes into his wax tablet, and in the dull timbre of long-faded enthusiasm, said, "Are any of the goats unusually productive?" "No," Lucius replied, "but 2 of them are emotionally needy." The scribe nodded solemnly. "We'll list them under unpredictable assets." Sometimes, during particularly quiet census days, scribes would invent categories just to stay awake. One ambitious fellow in Antioch created a whole subsection for chickens that might be lying, after a particularly confusing poultry count. But there was a larger point to this grand enumeration. Beyond updating their snail-paced scrolls and preparing more accurate tax expectations, you seem to have acquired 3 new rooms and a worrying number of marble statues Publius. It formed the backbone of Roman dignity. Citizens were proud, or at least contractually willing, to be listed in the empire's official records. It was also, rather importantly, how Rome kept track of who could vote, who could serve in the military, and who could lie about both with measured risk. Once the numbers were tallied and categories drawn, the real poetry of the census began: budgeting. The Senate would squint thoughtfully at a staggering column of goat-toting peasants and decide whether the empire needed more roads, fewer aqueducts, or perhaps a statue dedicated to a particularly stoic pigeon. And so, night would fall over the provinces, warm and buttery. As the censors wiped down their wax boards, the scribes packed away the styluses, and the goats, blissfully unaware of their crucial statistical role, dozed under the fig trees. For Romans, the census was less about counting and more about being counted. A quiet reminder that in the great machinery of empire, everyone mattered, even if only as a line item sandwiched between turnips and questionable chickens. As the candlelight flickers low across the tiled floor of the censor's office, and the scrolls are bundled with sleepy reverence, we drift now toward our next imperial inefficiency, one that involves mail delivery times, sandaled couriers, and scrolls that dramatically fail to arrive on time. If you were a Roman senator in the year 146 CE, and you woke up on a Tuesday morning, which might have been called Dies Martis, the day of Mars, you wouldn't start your day in a toga. No, that would come later. First, you'd rise with the sun, stretch with the weary groan of a man who had debated grain tariffs the previous afternoon, and head to your atrium for what the empire called the start of a new work day. Now, let's be clear. The Roman Empire was a magnificent machine of roads, taxes, aqueducts, and utterly excessive census-taking. But even the mightiest machine must be oiled, painstakingly, pedantically, with bureaucratic parchment, and at least 2 scribes who disapprove of each other's handwriting. And so, the wheels of empire turn slowly, deliberately, dragging behind them a paper trail longer than the Appian Way. In an unassuming building just behind the Palatine Hill stood the Tabularium, Rome's state archive and a fortress of forgotten memos. It's where the empire's secrets went to nap, in cubbyholes guarded by clerks whose only weapon was passive aggression and an encyclopedic knowledge of ink types. Somewhere deep in this marble mausoleum of data worked Tullius Varro, an imperial record keeper with a passion for detail and zero tolerance for excitement. He was a man for whom the difference between registered and sub-registered documents was not only meaningful, but thrilling. He once lost sleep over a misfiled aqueduct permit, and he wasn't even the one who misfiled it. Tullius would begin his morning with a review of scrolls, rolled, not folded, as folding was reserved for letters and other forms of heresy. He sat in a modest wooden chair that creaked every time he leaned forward to transcribe, a sound that underwrote the bureaucratic heartbeat of Rome. Around him echoed the gentle scratching of styluses on wax tablets, the ancient precursor to note-taking apps, just crunchier, and the soft murmur of clerks arguing over whether a new road outside Brundisium should be classified as a via or merely a semivia, which was apparently a thing. Occasionally, inside this symphony of subdued bureaucracy, a courier would burst in, breathless and bearing messages wrapped in twine and dust. These were usually transcripts from provincial governors, filled with thrilling updates such as taxes collected, weather warm, sheep accounted for. One particularly memorable report from Gaul included a drawing of a very round chicken. Though they worked in the shadows of empires and emperors, men like Tullius wielded a quiet power, the ability to delay projects by an entire equinox if the correct form hadn't been stamped by both the quaestor and an augur. Why an augur? Because you wouldn't dare build a bathhouse without checking which way the birds flew that morning. Obviously. But Tullius's favourite days were census review days. These monumental documents catalogued who lived where, owned what, and whether they qualified to be called citizen, peregrinus, or simply that guy near the olives. He once found a numerical discrepancy in the household count of a small village in Lusitania. After 6 weeks of correspondence, they discovered the family in question had been accidentally counted twice, once in their home and once on the holiday beside the Tiber. Such were the thrills of the imperial ledger. Lunch was usually simple: olives, bread, the occasional salted fish. There was no time for feasting when there were land deeds to verify, and yet there was camaraderie among Roman administrators, an unspoken bond forged over inconsistent ink delivery and the ceaseless demand for more copies. Tullius didn't seek promotion. To be appointed head scribe would mean fewer stamps and more supervisors. He preferred his current post: quiet, predictable, endlessly scrollable. As the sun leaned westward across the rooftops of Rome, Tullius would stretch his aching shoulders, tie up the last of his documents with a neat leather thong, and offer a silent nod to the statue of Minerva by the exit, a small ritual for paperwork well done. Outside, the air smelled faintly of dust and ambition. Inside, the scrolls slumbered, secure in their wooden cradles, dreaming of future historians never destined to read them. And while Rome sculpted its emperors in marble, it carved its true heart in ledger lines and municipal tax codes. Tomorrow, as you might expect, would bring another certified copy of a form requesting authorization to build a small fountain in Puteoli. But first, first we must cross the sea, quietly, bureaucratically, aquatically. By the year 142 CE, the Roman Empire was humming along like a well-oiled olive press. In the bustling boiler room of administration, nestled within the marble corridors of the imperial bureaucracy, paperwork reigned supreme. While gladiators clashed in the Colosseum and legions marched along the dusty fringes of empire, something far more steady, and admittedly less cinematic, was taking place across Roman provinces. The calculating, copying, and cataloguing of things. It was tax season, which in the Roman world was more of a perpetual drizzle than a seasonal storm. Scrolls stretched out across desks the length of cargo ships. Publicans, Rome's famously creative tax contractors, clicked away on their abacuses, tabulating everything from goat head counts to fish sauce exports. Somewhere in Antioch, a man was charged for owning one too many donkeys. Somewhere in Gaul, a woman was fined for not fully declaring her vineyard's capacity. And somewhere in Alexandria, a clerk fell asleep mid-rollout of a fiscal scroll so extensive it doubled as a family tent. Now, tax in Rome wasn't just about collecting coin. It was about ensuring the gods of bureaucracy were fed with parchment. Take the tributum soli, the land tax, a lovely excuse for officials to measure fields precisely. Scribble down how many fig trees you had, then charge you doubly if you dared to grow olives without permission. And then there was the tributum capitis, which essentially meant paying for the privilege of existing, a fee that historians lovingly call the head tax, because nothing says civic pride like being invoiced for your skull. But Roman administrators weren't just obsessed with taxes. No, they were also deeply enamored with records. For every tax assessed, a document. For every cartload of wheat, a receipt. For every official letter sent, a copy, and then a backup copy, and then a third, just in case the first two were gobbled by damp storage or a particularly nutritional rodent. In the basilicas, which doubled as civic halls and complaint arenas, magistrates read scrolls aloud with the enthusiasm of sleep-deprived librarians. Quills scratched steadily. Ink smudged artfully. One could almost hear the soft thunk of wax seals being pressed down like gentle stamps of imperial affection. The emperor at the time, Antoninus Pius, was not a man of wars or wild parties. He was, by many accounts, extraordinarily decent. A ruler so peaceful, the gods of chaos dozed off in sheer boredom. Under his reign, Rome enjoyed a great hush of stability. Ancient historians remarked that he rarely left Italy, a man so committed to administrative calm that he probably scheduled his naps. His energy was channeled into salads of laws and justice. Under Antoninus, juridical reforms blossomed like apricot trees. Cases were reviewed more fairly. Slaves could bring legal actions against their masters, a revolutionary notion that probably made traditionalists spit out their garum season breakfast. Even the Senate, that august body of elder statesmen, found itself drowsily content. They debated aqueduct maintenance. They argued over urban street lamps. There was an actual recorded discussion about the proper spacing between market stalls. These were heady times. If Rome under Nero felt like a festival at a burning building, Rome under Antoninus felt like a quietly organized filing cabinet. Bureaucrats in tunics padded across mosaic floors with armfuls of paperwork, whispering greetings to one another like ancient receptionists in a temple of ledgers. The empire was vast, yes, but not unmanageable. Not with enough plum ink and the collective anxiety of 1,000 overworked scribes willing to document goat thefts in triplicate. Meanwhile, in rural provinces, governors sent reports back to Rome so detailed they included sheepcoat conditions and suspicious smells in public squares. The emperor read them all, probably with the serenity of a man who recognized the empire was not sustained by swords, but by spreadsheets, or, in more accurate terms, scroll sheets. And so, the Roman machine churned not with fanfare but with quiet efficiency. Ledgers balanced, disputes resolved, border posts inventoried for blanket supplies. As night fell over the eternal city, the temple of Saturn, home to the state treasury, stood quietly in the moonlight. Beneath its columns, a scribe yawned gently as he sealed the final ledger of the day. Ink dried slowly in the candle glow, and far from the capital, at the muddy edges of the empire, a messenger galloped under the stars, bearing a scroll marked non-urgent, the oxymoronic heartbeat of a civilization powered by the ever-reliable pulse of procedure. But our dreaming doesn't end there, for even Roman plumbing had its paperwork, and in the distance, a water inspector dons his toga with bureaucratic solemnity as another dull and delightful day begins. Not all roads in the Roman Empire led to glory. In fact, a decent many led straight to the office of Quintus Aelius Gracchus, deputy sub-archivist of Inland Way Station's third cohort. A man whose primary task was slowly and methodically cross-referencing transit permits for donkey convoys between Aquileia and Mediolanum. Now you might imagine Roman bureaucracy as a flurry of togas and wax tablets flying through the air. But in truth, it was more like a polite, olive-scented standstill. Most days in the administrative halls of the empire were spent not making decisions, but rather gently escorting them from one department to another until someone lost the scroll. Our dear Gracchus, semi-proud son of a tax collector and an occasionally lucid augur, had served the empire diligently for 14 years, 8 months, and, according to the corner of his office calendar, 3 days. His corner of the sprawling bureaucratic basilica smelled softly of ink, cloves, and unresolved memos. He wore his tunic just a little too tightly, which created the occasional squeak when he reached for the top shelf, where menus from past Saturnalias were still filed under festive logistics. His latest professional adventure involved resolving a duplication in toll receipts issued near Lake Garda. Apparently, 2 otherwise identical donkeys named Felix had crossed a border post within an hour of one another. What ensued was a scandal of titanic apathy, resulting in no less than 7 hours of heated papyrus swapping. 2 witnesses had to be interrogated under the influence of tepid honey water, until one finally admitted that his donkey was more of a Marcus really. To resolve such critical matters, the empire relied not on swords, but on sand timers, wax seals, and monotone debates about the regional variations of barley tariffs. Meanwhile, beyond the marble columns and murmuring scribes, the very concept of time itself seemed to move differently. The sun, when viewed through the basilica's high windows, poured onto mosaic floors in slow golden pools, loyally following the routines of these unsung heroes of order. Nothing surprised them anymore. Not a grain tax miscalculation, not a forged census scroll, not even the time a pigeon flew into the archives, signed a form by accident, and was honorably discharged from the army 6 months later. It wasn't uncommon, in these days, for an entire morning to pass simply in verifying whether or not someone had, in fact, died. Death records could be ambiguous if the deceased had excellent penmanship and a son who shared his name. Many such cases were resolved when the citizen in question appeared in person to prove he was not, in fact, a ghost, but merely late. Charming, yes, but not deceased. The key to managing this perpetual machine was a fine balance between knowing the forms, remembering who needed a bribe, and perhaps most crucially, afternoon naps. The Romans called it meridiana quies, a brief respite after a light meal of lentils and administrative existentialism. Gracchus took his nap precisely at the 6th hour, using the works of Vitruvius as a pillow. While some considered architecture heavy reading, he found the descriptions of column ratios quite soothing. His dreams often featured strong Doric lines and surprisingly helpful tax auditors. Elsewhere, clerks in charge of ink rations held court with tiny corrals of sharpened styluses. They measured wax by the finger breadth. Even the smallest bureaucratic tools were tallied and audited, lest an empire be undone by unaccounted writing utensils. In fact, one of the lesser-known Roman proverbs went, "Calamus perdita, imperium deficit." A lost stylus spells a fallen empire. Probably not commonly, used but inscribed above one of the lesser doors to the archive room, perhaps by a particularly nervous scribe. Evenings arrived quietly in the hallowed halls of Roman paperwork. The wind whispered through scroll cubbies and kissed the hems of dusty vestments. Gracchus, with the patience of a granite countertop, placed his final seal of the day with a satisfying thunk and reaches for an almond. Though his duties rarely yielded applause, or indeed witnesses, he knew theirs was a quiet war. A war of commas, signatures, and properly catalogued permits. Outside, the last glow of sun dissolved into the Tiber's slow rhythm. Somewhere far off, an aqueduct continued doing precisely what it had done all day, being exceptionally functional. And as the city sighed into twilight, another rediscovered form fluttered on a desk, waiting patiently for review. But that, dear listener, is a tale for another scroll. There were few thrills in the Roman Empire more universally yawn-inducing than the annual census. Yet, somehow, across the sprawling territories of Roman dominion, the census was a bureaucratic ballet where everyone, senator to sandalmaker, was expected to pirouette precisely when prodded, and all for the glory of spreadsheets meticulously hand-scribed on papyrus. The Romans didn't just count citizens because they liked numbers. No, they counted them because Rome adored taxes. Taxes funded roads, aqueducts, legions, and the occasional marble statue with an expression like it had just realized it was unpaid. The census was the bedrock of this neatly oiled tax machine. Every Roman citizen was dutifully catalogued, his property assessed, his livestock noted, even his number of slaves tallied with the grim efficiency of a sheepdog armed with a stylus. Every 5 years, the censors, two austere men who genuinely believed that seriousness was a cardinal virtue, would ascend to their role as official nose counters of the empire. Although you'd expect a job that involved lots of ink, posturing and scowling to appeal only to the most insufferable sorts, censor was actually one of the highest honours Rome could bestow. Nothing said elder statesman like walking through neighbourhoods with a retinue of scribes, measuring vineyard boundaries and noting who owed 3 goats and a bronze urn. And such details mattered. A horse could kick over a barn, but only a census could determine if you owed enough grain taxes to feed that same horse until Saturnalia. Citizens had to provide full inventories of their households, and not unlike modern holiday dinners, this usually involved a fair amount of creative embellishing and strategic omissions. Name, the scribe would ask with barely concealed disinterest. Lucius Appius Marius. Occupation? Retired centurion, now lightly involved in artisanal olive oil. Any dependents? Just my wife, 3 children, a sister who insists on staying, and a goat named Octavius. He doesn't count though, he thinks he's a dog. And thus, Octavius remained tax-free. Now, if you were a Roman aristocrat, the process was more elaborate, yet also more selective in its honesty. Patricians, ever unbothered by peasant things, liked to showcase their wealth without appearing entirely taxable. "Oh, this villa," they'd say, gesturing grandly. "It's not so much mine as the gods. I'm merely borrowing it from Apollo." Needless to say, Apollo didn't file many liability forms. Of course, no Roman administrative task could be truly complete without a ceremony. The lustrum was the ritual ending of the census, and it brought an unusual flavour of excitement to the otherwise tepid broth of state bookkeeping. It took place at the Campus Martius, that grand open field where Rome stretched its civic muscles, and involved the sacrifice of a suavetorelia, a pig, a sheep, and a bull. offered to Mars in hopes that the god of war would bless the citizen rolls with peace, or at the very least, not destroy anything expensive. The suavitaurilia itself was seen as the high point of this entirely paperwork-based affair, because there's nothing like watching a trio of animals being ceremonially processed to really drive home the seriousness of your fiscal reports. As the smoke wafted lazily over Rome's skyline, one could practically hear the collective sigh of relief from every provincial governor shirking his report deadlines. Praise be to Mars until next time. And oh, the provincial governors. Their role in the census extended the tedium across seas and deserts, stretching Rome's administrative net into Gaul, Egypt, Britannia, even far-off Mesopotamia, where provincial officials, many of them former military men, suddenly found themselves drawing diagrams of pig populations instead of battle formations. One such governor, Gnaeus Calpurnius in distant Hispania, sent a now famous letter to the Senate that read in part, "People here grow tired of being counted. I swear the donkeys changed names just to confuse us." The letter survived, tucked in a dusty archive, a small yet poignant testimony to the enduring boredom of empire. In these quiet, measured rituals of enumeration lay the true muscle of Rome, not in legions or lions, but in ledgers. The content, the counted, and the countable all played their part in keeping the big machine humming, even if it occasionally coughed up a goat named Octavius. And so, with census figures filed, ink dried, and Mars presumably satisfied with his mixed meat barbecue, Rome could once again return to its usual affairs, urban planning, law-making, and wondering where all the good marble had gone. Which brings us gently, ever so gently, to a new matter entirely, the curious case of Roman post offices. Because, dear sleeper, even in a world of legions and lictors, someone still had to deliver the scrolls, somewhere between the crackling of oil lamps and the muted rustle of togas against polished marble floors. A quiet miracle was taking place across the Roman Empire. It was time for the census. Yes, nothing quickens the ancient pulse quite like a good, thorough bureaucratic head count. Every 5 years, or more accurately, whenever the imperial administration remembered, it was customary for Rome to tabulate its people, not out of a warm curiosity or the Roman equivalent of a neighborhood barbecue, but for taxes, military service, and, rather charmingly, ego. An empire had to know just how impressive it was. The census was orchestrated by a pair of magistrates known as censors, individuals chosen more for their stern brows than their charisma. These were men well versed in judging both populations and morality, like a cross between a tax official and a deeply judgmental uncle. Once in office, they would supervise the registration of citizens, property tallies, and whether or not your grandfather's virtue would still count toward your social status. Across the sunlit hills of Latium and the dry fields of Hispania, entire villages lined up, stewing gently beneath summer skies, waiting to state their names, parentage, and whether they'd mysteriously acquired an extra donkey since the last census. Pronouncing your lineage correctly was vital. Remembering too few ancestors could raise suspicions. Inventing a few too many could get you reassigned to the try again later line. This glorious accounting was not swift. Entire months would pass as scribes huddled over tablets, scrawling in wax and squinting suspiciously at anyone who said they only owned just enough wheat fields to avoid a higher bracket. All the while, farmers, potters and fishmongers internally debated whether it was worth confessing to that side business selling fermented fish paste out of their cousin's courtyard. In the more organized corners of the administration, tablets were collected, organized, reorganized, misplaced, found again under someone's sandals, and finally tallied. Experienced clerks cross-referenced these numbers with earlier spreadsheets, or rather, scrolls, and sometimes celebrated the discovery of an extra taxpayer the way one might celebrate finding a denarius in a sofa cushion. Meanwhile, nestled in the imperial capital, bureaucrats coordinated an even duller version of the same dance. These were the days of wax-stained toga hems and ink-flecked elbows. The empire ran not on swords or senators, but on records, requisitions and replacement brush orders. Paper pushers, or wax tablet pushers to be precise, whispered triumphantly of updated grain supply charts and the staggering thrill of a properly alphabetized registry of municipal mule ownership. Most of these thrilling administrative operations occurred in the tabularium, Rome's great archive, which sat smugly on the Capitoline Hill, peering down over the forum like a grandfather who has very important papers in his lap and an extremely low tolerance for noise. It was a temple of dullness, echoing with the soft scraping of styluses and the occasional yawn of a scribe whose idea of scandal was a misfiled census form from Dalmatia. Still, behind this veil of numerical numbness, the census had a very real consequence. It determined who you were, legally speaking. Citizens were ranked by wealth and status and assigned to voting blocks accordingly. Not that this mattered tremendously once emperors stopped pretending elections were real, but the illusion was maintained because Rome loved nothing more than tradition, especially the kind that made a citizen feel important while having absolutely no power. Interestingly, for women, the census was less personal. They weren't citizens in the political sense, so their heads were counted alongside livestock and minor gods. Though they played vital roles in households and marketplaces, the official record simply noted them as part of the male-led domus, faithful women defined ever so faintly by the orbit of fathers or husbands. But beneath that bureaucratic invisibility, women maneuvered the system with shrewdness, slipping influence into corners where scrolls dared not reach. As the census wound on, new data flowed endlessly downstream, toward tax collectors, toward consuls, and most importantly, toward the imperial treasury, where all roads, scrolls, and denarii ultimately converged. And so, through the gentle machinery of routine enumeration, the empire continued its calm, calculating pulse, not with glory, not with grandeur, but with the slow, methodical heartbeat of paperwork. Now, as torches flicker gently in the quiet corners of the tabularium, and a scribe stretches his back with the grace of one who's just discovered a misspelled tributary province, we drift softly onward, to a topic even more riveting than population counts, imperial postage, a particularly soothing corner of Roman bureaucracy. Yes, such a thing existed, was the robust art of census taking. Oh, the census, the Roman Empire's version of spreadsheet enthusiasm. Every 5 years, give or take a war, a plague, or a Jupiter-related festival, men of unimpeachable tedium, known as censors, would descend like very polite hawks upon the populace to count, classify, and codify. Imagine this: a slow-moving parade of sandals and togas through the dusty roads of Sabina or Picenum, stopping at each domus not to offer news or wine, but to gently pester families into reporting how many goats they'd harvested, how many slaves were still standing, and whether their third cousin still counted as a dependent. Some citizens, roused from their midday nap, would offer embellished accounts: 2 extra vineyards, a cousin who definitely didn't exist, and a chariot fleet entirely invented out of boredom. The censors, with their little wax tablets and impressively straight faces, would nod, scribble, and move on, all while plotting the next tea break. But there was purpose in the paperwork. Of course there was. The census didn't just pad the empire's scroll-filled archives. It determined taxation categories, military obligations, and who got the best seats at the theatre. In Rome, everything boiled down to class, and the census was the soup ladle. Senatorial class? Congratulations. You owed more taxes and far more evening invitations. Equestrian class. You got to avoid most battles and wear better sandals, often simultaneously. Plebeian class. Thank you for your grain quota. Now please avoid assembling. But the real excitement, the kind that makes your toga flutter with anticipation, was the random appearance of moral audits. That's right. Along with counting heads and sheep, the censors were also keepers of public morality. Had you neglected your civic duties, skipped out on temple offerings, hosted a party suspiciously full of questionable dancing, there was a box for that. The censors could demote citizens, shame entire lineages, or worst of all, fine you for indecorous behavior with a neighbor's spouse. And if you thought your local bureaucrat had power, consider this. The censor could strike your name from the Senate. Not because you plotted rebellion or embezzled marble, mind you, but perhaps because you were just a bit too flashy with your purple-trimmed tunic. Style crimes met state scrutiny. Drapery was a serious business. Still, many Romans viewed the census as a kind of necessary tickle, slightly irritating but undeniably important. It reassured them that the empire knew where its boots were kept and who owed those boots a pair of feet come conscription season. Let us not forget the glory of nomenclature. The census also tracked one's tria nomina, the solemn trio of personal name, family name, and call sign of you and your ancestors dating back to that cousin who allegedly fought a hydra. For those with ambitions or an eye on a senatorial marriage, polishing one's name into a little scroll-ready gem was half the fun of participating. Quintus Flavius Maximus Minimus might not have conquered provinces, but at least his name could conquer ink. Among the more tedious duties was counting centurions absent due to campaign, missing grain stores, and administrative errors caused by a bored scribe who accidentally used goat parchment instead of the official oxhide variety. Grains and goats, truly the rhythm section of Roman bureaucracy. And of course, these figures were returned to Rome, where they were transformed through the alchemy of ink and opinion into vivid charts, drawn with ink brushes on enormous scrolls, then stored in archives so large one could get lost in them and still be found 2 emperors later. It was said that Augustus himself kept copies of certain key censuses under his bed for late-night reading. Whether that was to check tax revenue or simply to lull himself to sleep with the number of olive presses in Umbria is unclear, but either way, it speaks to the soothing, sacred place the census held in imperial hearts. So as the sun set on another 5-year accounting effort, censors would return home with wax-covered fingers and satisfaction in their souls. Everything was counted, everyone was recorded, and the world, at least for the moment, was decidedly in numerical order. But elsewhere, beyond the candlelight glow of tabulation, something even more thrilling stirred. Correspondence. Yes, letters. Official ones. Imperial even. The ones that required 4 wax seals and 3 couriers to deliver. And that, my dear sleeper of the empire, is where our parchment shall unfold next, somewhere between the 8th census of Cappadocia and the 12th inspection of grain warehouses in Alexandria. Roman bureaucrats found themselves in their true element, contemplating the logistics of amphora labeling. You might think empire building was all swords and sandals, but alas, the real empire was built with wax tablets, tally sticks, and the eternal question, which scroll is that decree written on again? In the less than thrilling heart of the Roman administrative machine, nestled in a dusty office in the town of Tarraco, modern-day Tarragona, Spain, a mid-level curator named Gaius Fabius Numerianus had just settled in for his mid-morning scroll review. It was parchment quiet, except for the faint rustle of a toga and the subtle scratch of a stylus cataloguing the number of iron nails requisitioned by the local legion 6 months ago. The number, if you must know, was 3,247. Why that many? No reason anyone could remember. It was just the number that made the clerks feel safe. Gaius had a job of such monumental tedium. It might have been punishable by metaphysical exile in other cultures. He was, officially, Curator Tabularum Provincialium, overseer of provincial records. Unofficially, he was the Gentleman of Stamps, the Sultan of Seals, the Baron of Backlogs. His job was to verify that every tax receipt across the province had been properly copied, double-checked, salted, and stored in the regional archives that somewhat resembled dry bread museums with less foot traffic. His greatest battle during his 32-year service was not with Gauls or Dacians, but with weevils, paper-eating ones, the famed Curculio papyrus, a beetle with no regard for imperial decrees. For 4 fiscal seasons, he waged war with vinegar traps and despair. The beetles won, of course. They always do. But Gaius held the line and issued new guidelines on scroll storage conditions, which no one read. His assistant, a daydreamy youth named Lucan, once asked him during the midday fig break why records needed to be copied 3 separate times. Gaius had responded with the solemnity of a high priest. "Because if you only copy something twice," he whispered, "one version may be destroyed by fire, and the other by wine." By wine. It happens more than you'd think. When not defending, scrolls against mold, spillage, or casual theft by drunk scribes, the Roman record keepers also dabbled in the noble practice of public address repetition. That is, announcements in the forum were to be declared not once, but thrice. So even the sleepiest of citizens might catch that new grain ration policy. For this honour, cities employed professional precons, town criers, who bellowed with the fury of mountaintop thunder, but only from the waist up. From the waist down, they wore sandals that squeaked slightly on marble, giving the announcements an unintentionally musical quality. To make matters more interesting, Roman public notices were also painted on walls. If you've ever wondered what ancient graffiti artists aim for, it wasn't provocation, it was procurement. Procurement of decent sidewalks, improved waste removal, and better lamp oil regulation hours. These civil service murals competed for space with ads for gladiator events and vaguely inappropriate poetry anonymously signed by someone named Marcus, while administrative records swelled with lists of pig counts and road repairs. The imperial post, cursus publicus, carried them across thousands of miles at speeds best described as determined trot. Couriers passed messages through a relay of inns called mutationes, where one could change horses, gripe about weather, and question the meaning of bureaucracy, all before sunset. The emperor himself might dispatch an edict addressed to Noricum, only for it to unknowingly travel slightly northward due to a mistranslation of a place name and an overly confident donkey. And still, the empire ran, like honey dripping slowly through an amphora crack, sticky, inefficient, and vaguely sweet to the right constitution. Perhaps the greatest miracle wasn't the legions or the aqueducts or the 100-year shine of a good toga clasp. It was the quiet power of the local quester, methodically balancing a ledger by candlelight, cross-referencing olive oil imports while gently humming a tune from his youth. Never remembered by marble statues, rarely noted in senatorial minutes, and yet somehow everything kept moving forward. Tomorrow, that same quester would wrestle with a new request from the tax collectors in Gallia Narbonensis, a minor discrepancy involving sheep counts. It would require 2 letters, a courier, and an entire afternoon of sighing. But that's a lullaby for another night. The 6th hour of the Roman daylight, known to you and me rather unimaginatively as lunchtime, was a pivotal moment in the otherwise directionless daily bureaucratic meanderings of the empire. Across the sprawling reaches from Britannia to Syria, from the damp marble offices of Aquileia to the sun-cracked halls of Cyrene, quills paused, wax tablets were reluctantly lowered, and hundreds of scribes sighed in unison for a brief escape from endless commodity tallies and land tax reports. Roman bureaucrats, you see, were not quite the dashing warriors of frontier legions, nor the oratorical gladiators of the Senate. No, these were the brave souls tasked with tracking olive oil quotas, grain shipments, length of aqueduct shadows, and, arguably, their most thrilling task, standardizing road mile markers. It might sound tame, and it truly, beautifully was. Let us journey now to the provincial administration office in Lusitania, a modest corner of the empire perched on what is now the coast of Portugal. Inside, under a fluttering awning and the lazy buzz of flies contemplating the meaning of bureaucracy, 2 clerks sat hunched over records of tax paid in goat cheese, carefully noting texture and rind firmness. One of them, Gaius Pompilius, was particularly proud of his ability to determine the age of cheese by scent alone, a talent that, while never officially recognized by the emperor, did once earn him an approving nod from his supervisor, an event he would document in 3 separate scrolls. It's important to understand the spectrum of official scroll documentation. A nod from a superior fell somewhere between column repaired promptly and local boy claims to have seen a minor household god in fish market. All were logged, sealed, and stored in the great administrative labyrinth known as the tabularium, Rome's marble memory. Speaking of the tabularium, an architectural masterstroke nestled above the Roman Forum, it was less a romantic sentinel of civilization and more of a large, drafty file cabinet. It held maps, censuses, correspondence, and an alarming number of complaints from provincial governors wondering if their last request for more papyrus had been lost in the Tiber or simply ignored. Statistically, both were equally likely. Back in Lusitania, Gaius and his colleague Lucius debated quietly over whether a recent delivery of salt counted as fine or coarse in designation. The classification would determine its warehouse shelf, and warehouse shelf identity determined tax, not unlike a sleepy precursor to barcode scanning. It was elusive work, combing through bags of salt, squinting and mumbling. Well, it's coarser than sand but finer than virtue. And we mustn't forget the notari, the secretaries trained in shorthand who could record your entire family history during a modestly long sneeze. Fast, fluid, and utterly indecipherable to anyone else, they were the empire's version of high-speed data entry meets mystical hieroglyphics. Some prankster notary claimed to sneak in tiny personal poems or haikus of boredom into their transcripts, though modern scholars have yet to confirm whether grain, more grain, stop, is poetic angst or simply a literal state of affairs. As for the bureaucratic elite, the rationales behind laws were often as foggy as the reasons behind the empire's obsession with precise weights and measures. A law that mandated urn measurements be labelled in Latin, Greek, and pictographs of sheep. Entirely believable. A requirement that goat taxes be substituted by cubes of salted fish if goats were unavailable. Documented, enforced, and deeply misunderstood to this day. Even the mechanisms of report delivery brought flourishes of well-practiced tedium. Messages arrived by foot, horse, boat, or if truly urgent, occasionally by a breathless official with a wax tablet tucked under his arm, tripping on paving stones in his earnest haste. These reports were opened with mild ceremony, involving unwrapping string, melting seal wax, inspecting for potential rodent interference, and finally, reading aloud to a room that had swiftly chosen this as their collective nap window. But lest we believe these people were any duller than ourselves, remember, they had ambitions, promotions, increased ceiling ring authority, the rare privilege of assigning aqueduct inspection routes to subordinates. Indeed, a truly successful Roman bureaucrat might, after decades of loyal parchment shuffling, be honoured with a mosaic in his image, usually placed, poetically, by the latrines. As the shadow of a laundry line lengthens gently across Gaius's scroll, and the slanting sun begins to gild the rooftops of the quiet town, you can almost hear the sleepy turn of one more storage shelf in the tabularium. Everything exactly where it belongs, until someone next century forgets how alphabetization works. Now, as night blushes against the sky and parchment is rolled back into careful scrolls, we drift across the empire's sleepy hum toward a place where even statues quietly judge the questionable definitions of urgent. Let us follow the night's breeze to a quieter office still, awaiting the gentle clatter of sandals, somewhere between the warm terracotta tiles of an imperial villa and the faint scratching of a quill against parchment. We find ourselves in the gloriously underwhelming world of Roman census taking. Not conquests, not chariot races, but the slow, bureaucratic ballet of counting people, pigs, and possibly a few overly ambitious figs. Every 5 years, because anything more frequent might evoke dangerous levels of excitement, the Roman state conducted a census. But before you imagine toga-clad clipboard wielders knocking on doors, picture instead a more ritualistic approach. The entire affair was so sanctified, it started with a purification rite known as the lustrum. Yes, the census was effectively baptized before people queued up to confess how many goats they owned and whether they had any sons eligible for military service. But why all the fuss, you ask? Oh, my dear listener, because to the Romans, a proper census wasn't just about tax. It was the very heartbeat of civic order. It told Rome who was important, who could be ignored, and who owed a rather awkward amount of tribute. It was the state's way of saying, we see you, we count you, now please stand in line. Censors, not to be confused with the modern idea of censorship, though equally fond of telling people what they couldn't do, were noble elders tasked with overseeing this process. These were dignified men, the kind who measured morality with furrowed brows and treated the number of slaves in your household as a reflection of your virtues. They would stride into forums heads high, scrolls in arms like papyrus-bearing peacocks, lists of names, property, ages, and occasionally the odd chicken. Now, the process wasn't exactly swift. Entire weeks might pass as citizens trudged to their assigned stations. There, standing beneath the beady-eyed statues of long-dead ancestors, they'd recite their details in what was known as professio. I, Gaius Publius Festivus, have 2 sons, 3 goats, and own a modest square of olive trees near the Appian Way. And then the clerk would nod, scratch it down with a stylus that had possibly seen better wax tablets, and wave them along. Some tried to bend the truth, not maliciously, of course, just a minor exaggeration here, a goat or 2 omitted there. But the censors were old hands at this game. They had a remarkable 6th sense for property inflation. If someone with suspiciously threadbare sandals claimed to own half of Etruria, the raised eyebrows could be felt from as far away as Alexandria. The real spice, by Roman standards, came when the censors reviewed the moral character of citizens. Yes, they quite literally rated your virtue. Adulterers, scandalous public drunkards, and those who played dice a little too enthusiastically might find themselves demoted in class, or worse, shamed by inscription. Try explaining that to your in-laws. Those who passed muster were sorted into their rightful socio-political containers. The top, naturally, were the senatorial and equestrian classes, Rome's answer to the Board of Trustees and their extremely well-shod horses. Then came the plebeians, hard-working and mostly uninterested in being sorted like produce. And finally, the capite censi, those so poor they were listed only as people with heads, which is a poetic way of saying they own nothing, but at least they're not headless. This indexing of humanity culminated with the reading of the solemn lustrum oath and a final tally presented to the Senate. A dramatic unveiling, if your idea of drama involves scrolls and the phrase, and furthermore, in the region of Umbria, 4,227 adult males and 198 plough animals were recorded. It said that Augustus, in his infinite organizational zeal, personally reviewed census data, likely with a goblet of wine in hand, gently nodding as he learned how many toothbrushes existed in Gaul, give or take. He used it to fine-tune tax expectations, military recruitment, and even urban planning. Rome was many things, but it was never uncounted. So tonight, as you settle under the soft blanket of stars, or perhaps just your favorite knitted throw, remember that somewhere in the vast logistical heart of the empire, a frazzled clerk was falling asleep at his wax tablet, dreaming of accurately categorized livestock. And just beyond the horizon, another office beckons, quills poised, records yawning open like ancient scrolls hungry for more names. In the sleepy corners of imperial bureaucracy, buried among marble scroll cabinets and lead tablets etched with forgettable proclamations, lived some of Rome's most industrious and least admired public servants, official cartographers and road surveyors, the scribbling souls who spent their days not conquering Gaul or plumbing the depths of philosophy, but measuring distances between chicken coops outside Mediolanum and inns without roofs in the hills above Tarraco. Their work, and do try to stay awake just a little longer, contributed to the Putinger table, a kind of long scroll-shaped map of the Roman world that had no actual scale and bent geography into a sort of artistic lie. It tried, bless its heart, to make the empire navigable. What it actually did, in most cases, was keep mapmakers employed and confuse travelers exactly where the empire wanted them, not revolting, just slightly lost. Now, in the year 197, with Emperor Septimius Severus getting comfortable on the imperial cushion, slightly deflated due to budget constraints, attention turned to the maintenance of the cursus publicus, Rome's stately but overburdened courier system. Imagine, if you will, state-run horse hotels dotted across a continent, each staffed by tired men who knew 3 things. Horses wanted oats, travellers wanted baths, and nothing good ever came in a scroll sealed with imperial wax. Each station was called a mansio. Not to be confused with a proper Roman villa, a mansio was more of a lodging facility that said, "Stay here but don't enjoy it too much." It was just luxurious enough that no one could call it dire, and just uncomfortable enough to remind you that you were travelling at the pleasure of Rome, not for yours. A low-ranking official, known as a stationarius, managed each property. His duties included feeding the horses, managing the annoyed riders, and responding to complaints from centurions who insisted that the straw mattresses were organized insufficiently west to east. This was serious stuff. One misaligned pile of straw, and you had a disgruntled legate with a sore back and an extra large grudge heading into a provincial inspection. Meanwhile, back in the capital, high on bureaucratic moonlight and wine with just enough vinegar to pass as aged logistas, administrators of supply inventories, shuffled small wooden counters across abacuses in what passed as intense accountancy. These were not men of action. They were men of columns. Columns not of marble, but of numbers. And yes, once in a while, someone did actually die of boredom during the annual budget recitation ceremony, or at least pretended to, skillfully enough to skip the social hour afterward. Taxes needed collecting, naturally, but since Rome had long surpassed the point of collecting money, and instead enjoyed receiving an absurd range of goods in lieu of coin, think pigs, bricks, and the occasional wheel of regrettably lukewarm cheese, local tax collectors had developed the unique talent of appearing enthusiastic while wondering how many amphorae of fermented turnip paste they could fit onto a mule cart in one trip. Some of these collectors became so good at procuring taxes in kind that they were rewarded with promotions, not to escape the work, but to help develop the imperial storage strategy, which mostly consisted of put it in that barn and hope it's still edible next March. The grain surveyors and inventory priests would come each season, lifting the lids off of crates, nodding thoughtfully, and pretending to understand whether something had spoiled or simply evolved. Rome was a hungry machine after all. Even boredom needed to be provisioned. Of course, even these tedious cogs turned in rhythm with something unmistakably grand. The endless ledgers, the tired road markers, the crates of garlic presumed edible. It all mingled to pulse through the empire like a slow heartbeat, steady, administrative, and just sleepy enough to keep revolution at bay. And so, the couriers saddled up once more, whispers of orders tucked beneath their tunics and dreams of steady pensions in sleepy mountain settlements. Another day passed in splendid monotony. As twilight fell and the embers faded under the legista's oil lamp, somewhere near the Tiber, a wax tablet sighed quietly under a pile of requisition forms. It was time, now, for a fresh breath of tedium, something involving provincial finance. But that, of course, waits just ahead, under the cool shade of tomorrow's pergola. As dawn crept delicately over the terracotta roofs of Mediolanum, known to us now as Milan, a squadron of scrupulously overqualified bureaucrats was already hard at work, shuffling parchment like caffeinated squirrels. While the Roman Empire is often remembered for its military conquests and extravagant orgies, an odd pairing, really, it was the tireless scribbling of these toga-clad administrators that kept the imperial behemoth from dissolving into delicious chaos. This was especially true of the office of census tabulators, number wranglers whose entire lives revolved around estimating wheat production in distant provinces and trying to determine whether Cassius the Elder in Gaul had 6 sons or 7. The 7th might have been imaginary, or possibly a goat. Either way, the forms had to match. At the heart of this seemingly yawning tedium sat the provincial censor, Quintus Lucius Sabellus, a man so dedicated to accurate head counts that he once tried to count his own thoughts. He got to 12 before falling asleep, which is impressive, all things considered. Quintus's desk, a marvel of imperial minimalism, was adorned with a wax tablet, 2 styluses of varying moral alignment, an oil lamp shaped like Minerva's left foot, and a dried fig he claimed was for emergencies. His daily burden: reviewing tax declarations filed in distant villages by people who could neither write them nor read them, resulting in surprisingly creative interpretations of financial responsibility. At one point, a fisherman in Pannonia declared one fish as both property and dependent. But misfilings like that gave Quintus purpose. He would squint at the undulations of rustic Latin, adjust his sandals for psychological comfort, and decode the truth using equal parts logic, sarcasm, and a fondness for aquatic metaphors. He could often be heard muttering, "No one can own a river, Marcellus," as though speaking to a wayward child, or to Poseidon. Of course, the real bureaucratic drama played out not on the dusty parchment, or in the archives of Mediolanum's chilly back offices, but in the nightly forum meetings where department heads gathered to debate the imperial regulations on things like shoelace width, technically sandals, though the problem remains eternal, temple maintenance budgets, and the correct height of an obelisk for it to be considered intimidating but tasteful. One such evening, the planning subcommittee for civic aesthetics, known informally as the Marble Men, found themselves in a heated discussion about whether pigeons were divine messengers or merely aggressive skyfruit. The argument, naturally, was sparked by a particularly symbolic deposit on the shoulder of a statue of the Emperor Diocletian. Incidentally, a statue that Diocletian himself had ordered to be just life-sized enough to avoid being boastful. Amidst these debates, a small scroll arrived from the northern boundary of the empire, carried by an impressively bored-looking courier who had seen more goats than people on his 3-week journey. The scroll contained a humble request from a magistrate in Britannia to receive a fresh shipment of official wax tablets, as the current batch had been stolen by local druids who believed them to contain magical bird prophecies. As it happened, the druids had tried to plant one in a tree to see if it would bloom into more scrolls. It did not, but a nest of owls did mistake it for a condo. Quintus read the urgent missive with a sigh that could have crumbled Hadrian's wall. By Jupiter's stapler, how one was expected to maintain imperial cohesion when resources were being used as magical seedlings and owl housing was beyond him. Still, he dutifully arranged the shipment, included a strongly worded note in Latin, Gallic, and Druidic, and added a drawing of an owl with a red line through it for emphasis. And so, within this empire whose binary heartbeat was sword and scroll, it was the tranquil, unglamorous quill of men like Quintus that balanced the loud clang of conquest. Each time a gladiator fell in the Colosseum, somewhere, in an annex office, beneath shelves of scrolls, someone like Quintus carefully checked a box marked "Deceased, Non-Taxable." As the sun dipped behind the Alps and Mediolanum prepared for another night of lamplit bookkeeping and debate over municipal pergolas, the gentle rustling of parchment echoed like lullabies in marble chambers. In our next quiet hour, we shall drift south to a city where law, letters, and laurel wreaths knit a world not with swords, but with signatures. As dusk settled upon the cobbled back streets of Antioch and the sun painted sleepy brushstrokes across the eastern sky, the clerks of the Roman tax bureau prepared to do what they'd done every day for decades: shuffle ink-stained scrolls back and forth while sighing wistfully in perfect bureaucratic synchrony. You see, the Roman Empire, mighty and sprawling as it was, ran not on the musk of legionaries or the clamour of senators, but on the considerably quieter industry of provincial record-keeping. And in a tiny, musty office, tucked behind a fruit vendor and two goats too proud for their own good, Maximus Scribonius Quadratus was doing precisely that: record-keeping. Maximus, whose name carried the grandeur of heroism, had never once wielded a sword, unless you counted the exceptionally sharp stylus he accidentally dropped on his sandal last Saturnalia. He was chief assistant to the third assistant of the Regional Questors Grain Disbursement Review Committee, an enviable title that permitted him to wear a modestly purple-threaded sash on alternate Tuesdays and gave him access to the best inkstand, which he guarded a bit too jealously. His day began at the precisely estimated time of sometime after Rooster 2. After a breakfast of overly salted olives and the kind of bread you could use for minor masonry, he would march, amble resolutely, to his post and greet the tax papyri with the reverence most reserved for Caesar himself. On this particular day, Maximus was composing an addendum to a notice about updated fish market tariffs, following a dispute involving 12 eels, a crate of semi-fresh mackerel, and a merchant who claimed Poseidon's divine interference in his accounting. In true Roman fashion, rather than question the metaphysics of seafood economics, the magistrates opted to quietly adjust the eel tax and issue a memo. 2 memos, actually, in case the first one got trampled by mule traffic. Meanwhile, in the adjacent cubiculum, Livia Minor, no relation to the Empress except in ambition, was decoding a report from Gaul, wherein a minor provincial scribe, presumably deep in his cups, had doodled a centaur jousting a wine barrel on the margins of a shipment inventory. The report, aside from its keen insight into ancient equine barrel warfare, revealed that the wine taxes were being underreported by no fewer than 5 amphorae per shipment, a matter Livia planned to escalate to at least 3 committees, possibly 4 if she could find her other caliga, sandal. Administrative bungling, naturally, was a sort of performance art in the Roman Empire. Forms were duplicated twice, misfiled once, amended thrice for good measure, then ceremoniously archived in dust-choked rooms no one willingly entered unless bribed with dates and light gossip. This was not neglect. Oh no, the empire prided itself on delegation. A missive might take 3 weeks to cross the Mediterranean, stop in Alexandria for a sunbath, get transcribed by a sleepy apprentice named Gaius, who believed consonants were optional, then finally reach the Senate dais only for someone to ask what, on Jupiter's golden chin, threshold krabul f-lex, was meant to mean. Philosophers debated the syntax. Legislators debated budgets. And meanwhile, certain commodities, say garum sauce or dried lentils, fluctuated unpredictably, much like the mood of the Pontifex Maximus during tax season. The beauty of it all, of course, was the sheer tenacity of ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary paperwork. The empire did not fall in a single day, as historians so love to warn us. No, it painstakingly tripped over its own filing systems for centuries before finally sitting down and admitting it had misplaced the western half somewhere near Ravenna. And so, as the sun dipped past the rooftops and temple columns cast long shadows across bureaucracy's noble battlegrounds, Maximus rubbed his temples and sealed another scroll with wax and the smug satisfaction of a man who had survived yet another audit. The flickering oil lamp, its flame sleepy and half-hearted, lit the edges of new parchment. Tomorrow, Livia would bring up something about shipping discrepancies in the olive count of Hispania, and Maximus would pretend, convincingly, that he hadn't already planned a footnote response. But for now, the office sat still in the golden silence of twilight, papers quietly stacking themselves in dreams of order. The cicadas hummed their own version of the imperial anthem, and somewhere a town crier probably forgot his lines. Bureaucracy, after all, isn't remembered in marble, but in marginalia, and perhaps, just as the moon rose above the columned silhouettes, it was time to turn one last page and discover what other unimpressive but deeply soothing event was waiting quietly behind the next curtain of vellum and dust. By now, dear sleeper scholar, you've met the wine-pouring bureaucrats, the ink-stained clerks, and the empire's most dedicated paper pushers. But tonight, let us drift into the realm of imperial measurement units. Yes, the captivating metric of a civilization that had yet to invent the metric system. The Romans, ever dramatic, believed deeply in precision, so long as it was done approximately. Take the actus, for instance, a unit of length used to measure Roman land. It was as long as 2 oxen could plough without arguing. The actus was roughly 120 Roman feet, or about 35.5 meters, assuming the oxen were of average temperament. This became the backbone of farming records, tax rolls, and deeply heated arguments between neighbors who insisted the property line was definitely not their Marcus. Now, 1 actus squared, called a jugerum, was the standard unit of area in land measurement, and, incidentally, the perfect size for a small Roman farm or a decently dramatic legal dispute. It took its name from what one man with a yoke of oxen could plough in a single morning, followed, one assumes, by a long and bitter lunch while arguing with his wife about the shape of the field. Of course, the Romans didn't stop there. For liquids, they had the amphora, a ceramic jug that could hold about 26.2 litres. Conveniently, it doubled as breakfast storage and, if smashed in frustration, an excellent way to begin passive-aggressive neighbourly warfare. Wine taxes were often calculated by the amphora, meaning a good vintner always knew his numbers, and also how to hide a few extra bottles under a hay cart. Weight? That was ruled by the libra, which is where we get the word pound. A libra was about 327 grams, give or take the emperor's mood. Coins, grain, and even public works bribes were measured in librae. If you were really wealthy, you might live in a domus with walls thick enough to muffle the clink of secret liberal negotiations in the atrium. And time. Oh, time. The Romans had sundials that worked beautifully until nightfall, at which point time ceased to matter until further notice. If you were wealthy, a water clock might drip away in your courtyard, giving you a vague sense that the morning had passed, or that you had overcooked something again. But let us not forget the Roman calendar, a wondrous device of straight lines and imperial chaos. Before Julius Caesar stepped in with his Julian reform in 45 BCE, the lunar Roman calendar was so unreliable that politicians were adding or skipping months at will, like a child arranging toy blocks, but with legislative authority. One year might have 2 Februaries if it suited the consuls, and another year might be suspiciously missing a month during a tax cycle. It was the kind of timekeeping that could only be improved by dictatorship. Caesar, in a moment of time-bending clarity, added leap years and fixed the solar calendar to something approximate to the actual sun. Amazing, the things you prioritize after conquering Gaul. The months, thoughtfully named, honored gods, emperors, and the Roman preference for things that sounded important, such as Quintilis, later renamed Julius, because why not name July after yourself if you have a habit of reforming continents? Yet, even with these reforms, the Romans never quite synchronized every sundial and hourglass. Time remained a flexible concept, especially in the provinces. In fact, an official arriving late with taxes might be forgiven if he cited the angle of the sun over Hispania as his excuse, which in Roman times was just another way of saying traffic on the Appian Way was a nightmare. And here lies the quiet truth. The greatness of Rome did not solely rest upon legions or marble facades, but on its tireless drive to measure the land, the grain, the wine, the hours, and yes, the slow tick of imperial administration. There was truly a schedule for everything, and someone slow walking it down a corridor with a wax tablet in hand. So as you drift now, dear dreamer, imagine the rhythmic drip of a Roman water clock echoing through a shaded villa courtyard, the soft rustle of scrolls being reshelved, the distant clatter of an amphora being set just slightly off-center, and the eternal hum of an empire always trying to keep time with the sun. And somewhere, perhaps, a notary is still calculating how many jugera can fit between two quarrelling neighbors who both swear the ox ploughed farther in their direction. Let us now float toward the final hush of the imperial routine. Outside a modest bureaucratic complex in late 2nd century Antioch, the sun receded behind a veil of dust and distant marmoreal hills, leaving only the warm sigh of twilight. Inside the officium, the Roman administrative office continued its stately commitment to profound dullness. Lamps filled with fish oil flickered gently, casting sleepy shadows onto neat stacks of papyrus and terracotta, stamped with the imperial seal. Someone sneezed politely. Gaius Fabius Quietus, imperial clerk, first class and veteran of the Department of Provincial Weights and Measures, sat hunched over a small writing desk. He was the sort of man who had one heroic story. He once prevented a riot when he diplomatically discovered a baker had been misusing his grain ration to produce slightly smaller loaves. He resolved the conflict with a letter, 2 witnesses, and a late lunch. This evening, though, he wasn't resolving grain scandals, which were spicy affairs by Roman standards. No, tonight, he was proofreading a 3-page appendix entitled Recommended Storage Conditions for Standard Issue Olive Oil Amphorae, Revised Edition. He dipped his reed pen into a shallow dish of ink and sighed the sigh of someone about to describe a 3% curvature adjustment. Elsewhere in the building, a young apprentice scribe named Livia paced nervously. She had made a small but catastrophic clerical error earlier in the day, logging 5 crates of Gallic goose feathers as a military threat, rather than a luxury import. The entry now read, "Feathers hostile." It had caused a moment of mild alarm in the governor's office, and no small amount of feather-based satire. The empire, expansive and empire-y as ever, had systems for everything, from toga dye regulations to fire brick certification committees, each layer of control designed to keep chaos at bay, or at least to make it wait in the atrium with a stamped appointment slip. Meanwhile, in Egyptus, a bored tax assessor with particularly dainty cursive was finalizing camel census forms. The camel in question, named Horatius, had confusingly been registered in both Alexandria and Memphis due to his fickle owner and an unfortunate accident involving municipal boundary stones. After weeks of travel, review, and the employment of 2 retired philosophers for clarity, it was determined that neither papyrus was correct. Horatius was, in fact, a donkey. The donkey problem never did make it to the emperor's desk, primarily because the emperor, a reasonably competent ruler named Commodus, who liked dressing up as Hercules, was practicing his archery at the Senate. At night, under the stars, a different kind of order took over in Rome's vast web of administration. Couriers padded gently along the Via Appia with saddlebags full of papyrus and dissatisfying minutes from local council meetings. In some regions, pigeons carried abbreviated notes, including one especially sharp-beaked pigeon named Remus, who reportedly once made eye contact with a proconsul and wasn't impressed. But throughout these routines and regulations, amid the clerks, seals, pigeons, and mice-identified camels, there's something strangely beautiful. The Roman Empire, an absolute marvel of military might and engineering brilliance, is often remembered for its conquests, columns, and questionable moral flexibility. But perhaps most underrated of all was its boring competence. It's easy to overlook the quiet chapters of empires, those where records were kept, roads maintained, and the weight of fish tracked with alarming precision. It was these quiet repetitions, not the drama, that kept the world turning. Even now, as the oil lamp near Gaius Fabius Quietus began sputtering ever so slightly, and a cool breeze rolled through the shutters, history was being made in the form of a revised form regarding orchard insect mitigation strategies in the provinces of Hispania Citeria. Livia returned sheepishly with a corrected goose-feather report. Gaius, without looking up, nodded gently and placed it atop the pile destined for archiving in the impressively dull Hall of Standard Ledger Repositories, a room famed for its ambient silence and deeply unremarkable acoustics. Outside, crickets began their 1,000-year murmuring, undisturbed by imperial decrees or amphorae specifications. Lanterns dimmed, parchments curled gently at the edges, and far, far away the edge of the empire sank into another uneventful evening. No triumphal arches marked today, no golden eagle soared, just the soft victory of functional chairs, properly filed receipts, and the sweet, sweet sound of bureaucratic bedtime. And now, so too does your mind file everything away, neatly labeled, divinely dull, and exactly where it should be. Let the weight of unnecessary facts rest heavy on your pillow, and drift to sleep as the pages of history whisper their most boring, beautiful secrets. Good night, little citizen of the Empire. Sleep is the only appointment that never needs a seal.